Okay, so we'll have a quick discussion on the different types of product costing systems. Okay, specifically for today, we're going to start our discussion on job order costing. And so let's differentiate first the basic types. You have your process costing and job order costing. Now, if a company produces a lot of units, okay, having the same characteristics, ayan, or each unit is indistinguishable from other units of product, we expect these companies to use process costing. Now, since the nature of each product is identical, okay, it enables us to assign the same average cost per unit. Siyempre, kung pare-pareho yung characteristics ng mga products natin, we expect na dapat pare-pareho din yung mga costs nila. Ayan. But for job order costing, okay, there are many different products, okay, produced during each period, okay? And most of the time, products are manufactured to order. Ayan. They are tailored according to the needs of the customers. Okay? And because of the unique nature of each order or of each job, ayan, this requires tracing or allocating costs to each job and maintaining cost records for each job. So we expect that each product, since magkakaiba yung mga yan, there will be different costs for each. Okay? So, ayun. Now, to compare, although napag-discussionan na natin to, tama ba? Na-discuss na natin to from other videos. Okay, ito, quick comparison lang, parang review, no? As to the number of jobs worked for job order, madami yan. Okay, it really depends on the number of customer, the number of designs available, ayan. For process costing, okay, we expect there is a single product. Well, there may be more than one product, okay, but for each product, they are producing a lot of units, ganun. And costs are accumulated by job, dun sa job order. They are accumulated using the job cost sheet, okay? For process costing, costs are accumulated by department. And because of that, okay, average cost is also computed by job because costs are accumulated by job under job order. And for process costing, ganun din. Since costs are accumulated by department, average cost is also computed by department. So, for example, let's talk about your direct manufacturing cost, like direct materials and direct labor. They can be easily traced for each job. Now, in our previous discussions, okay, we already discussed the meaning of traceable cost, and allocated cost. When we say traceable cost, they can be easily estimated. They can be easily estimated because they are directly attributed to that product. So, kung ilang labor, kunyari, yung cost of direct labor pumunta sa job number 1, job number 2, job number 3. This one can be estimated, no? Like for example, yan, si Mr. A, okay, having a rate of 500 pesos per hour, just for example. For job 1, okay, he used 1 hour for job 1, 2 hours for job number 2, and 3 hours for job number 3. You simply multiply that, okay, and you will get the cost for direct labor. Okay, so ganun din doon sa sa direct materials, no? For example, we are using lumber and each lumber is measured in terms of board feet. Tapos magkano ba per board feet? 50 pesos na lang. So you simply multiply the cost per board feet, okay, times the board feet used, for each job, and you can trace the cost of direct materials for each job. Okay? For direct manufacturing cost, we trace them to each job. But for manufacturing overhead, okay, they are simply allocated. Okay? Ina-allocate natin. Palitan natin yung kulay. Ayan. Ina-allocate natin. Why? Because, gaya ng sinabi natin kanina, indirect cost cannot be directly traced. Okay? If you trace them, it is not practical. Okay? Or it's impossible to trace them. So what you do is you come up with a predetermined rate, ganon, you come up with a process on how you can distribute your manufacturing overhead per job. So sabi niya dito, they are allocated to jobs rather than directly traced to each job. Ayan, this is now an example of job cost sheet. Let's look at the elements, okay? So here you have the job number A143, okay, under department B3. Ano yung pinapagawa? Nagpapagawa sila ng wooden cargo crate. Okay, it's not yet completed but it's initiated in this date. Okay, so ayan, as we notice, no, here you will have the cost for direct materials, direct labor, and manufacturing overhead. And then we summarize them so that in the end, no, we'll be able to compute for the unit product cost. So let's have an example. The story starts, no, in your materials requisition form. Ayan, so may re-request ng materials, okay, based on the design, okay, given by the customer, okay, we need the following. So can you please issue me, ayan, can you please issue me the following. So ayan, you have 2x4, 12 feet, siguro kahoy ito, di ba? Kasi wooden crate eh. So you have the quantity, you have the unit cost, and then this is now the total cost that is issued. Ayan. Okay, and used in the job order, okay, A143. Now, this materials requisition form will now be the basis, no, for your direct materials cost in the job cost sheet. Again, okay, if you remember, okay, this has a substance, no? The substance of your job cost sheet is parang work in process siya. Di ba? Na-discuss natin to previously. Anyway, so assuming that's the only material that is issued, no, wala na pong iba, you can now get the total of your materials. And then you also have the employee time ticket. No, for example, we have Mr. I am skilled, no, who worked from 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. No, 8 to 4. So that is now 8 hours straight. So wala siyang break. With an hourly rate of $11, you simply multiply, okay? So you now have the cost of the direct labor. O diba, it can be easily traced, madaling ma-estimate. And assuming that's the only direct labor incurred, so we can now put them here and get the total. Kung meron pa o di, pending lang yung total. Basta lagay ka lang ng lagay. Okay, now, as we go along, no, please feel free to change the speed if you want or pause the video, okay, so that you can rewind and forward or take screen captures. Ayan. Anyway, let's continue. So for factory overhead, why do we need to use an allocation base? Okay, sabi kasi, manufacturing overhead is applied. They are not traced, they are applied to jobs that are in process. An allocation base such as direct labor hours, okay, or direct labor in dollars or machine hours is used to assign. Ayan. That's why they are also known as assigned cost. To assign manufacturing overhead to individual jobs. Ayan. So, gagamit na ngayon tayo dito ng predetermined overhead rate. Sabi dito, it is impossible or difficult to trace overhead cost to particular jobs. Manufacturing overhead consists of many different items ranging from the grease used in machines to production manager's salary. Oo nga naman. So how are you going to trace this, di ba? Or what about production manager's salary? Okay, this one is supervisory, so there's no direct contact with the products, and so you cannot trace the cost, tama? And there are many types of manufacturing overhead costs, okay, that are fixed even though output fluctuates during the period. So, ayan. Later we're going to discuss the effects of output, okay, vis-a-vis the capacity of the company when it comes to computing your predetermined overhead rate. Okay, pero, anyway, balikan natin yan mamaya. So, let's continue. Yan. The POHR, okay, or the predetermined overhead rate, used to apply overhead to jobs is determined before the period begins. Bakit ganun? Okay, i-estimate mo na siya. Bakit? So that it will be easier for us to bookkeep the cost, no? To prepare entries. You don't have to end, no? You don't have to wait at the end of the period just to come up with an entry for your factory overhead. With your predetermined overhead rate, okay, you can record them, you can book the cost, okay, as you go along. So how do you compute that? You have the estimated total manufacturing overhead cost for the coming period. Take note, estimate lang naman. Sir, what if the actual is different from the estimate? Okay, later we're going to discuss the over or underapplied overhead. Don't worry, the difference will be accounted. Ang importante, first you have to come up with an estimate, total manufacturing overhead cost, and then you divide that by the estimated total units in the allocation base. So what is the allocation base? This could be your direct labor hours, no, or machine hours, or maybe labor cost, okay, or materials used. Take note, they should be causal in nature. Let me write that down. There should be causality para mas maganda. Anong ibig sabihin nito? For example, one of your overhead is, let's say, the power consumption. Okay? And that power consumption is due to the machineries used. So the longer you use your machines, the higher will be the power consumption in your overhead. So it's wise to allocate, okay, to allocate power consumption based on machine hours. Tama? Or for example, one of your overhead is, let's say, the grease used, yun na lang, grease, the hardware nails, the sandpaper. O yan, you can allocate that based on direct labor hours. Because the longer time it took your manpower to work on your product, okay, ibig sabihin, there will be more supplies used. Okay, so that is a good allocation base. Pag minsan nga lang, okay, since your factory overhead costs are so diversified, okay, sometimes one allocation base is not enough. Which is the reason why companies will have more than one predetermined overhead rate. Okay. Anyway, as of this point, based on GAAP, there should only be one plant-wide predetermined overhead rate. Ayan. Sabi niya, ideally, the allocation base is a cost driver that causes the overhead. Yun nga yung sinabi natin kanina. There is causality. Ayun. Next. Why is there a need for a predetermined overhead rate? Okay, because using a predetermined overhead rate makes it possible to estimate total job cost sooner. You don't have to wait at the end of the period. Ayan. It's easier to estimate, kumbaga. Ayan. So how do you estimate, no? Once you have computed for the predetermined overhead rate, you simply multiply that by the actual activity. Siyempre, the one that is related, no? Related to your activity base. So for example, if your predetermined overhead rate is based on machine hours, okay, so you multiply that with the actual machine hours used, no, in your manufacturing or in your production. So ayan na yung formula ng predetermined overhead rate. So for example, you have 640,000, okay, as your estimated manufacturing overhead, and then for the current period, you have 160,000 direct labor hours. So you simply divide that. This means that for every direct labor hours used in the production, you will be incurring $4. Tama po? Ayun, yun. Diniscuss ko pa, nandyan na pala sa slide. Ayan. So, if this is applied based on direct labor hours, let's review ha. This one came from direct materials requisition slip. This is from your employee time ticket. Okay. And the employee used 8 hours. And we have computed $4 as our predetermined overhead rate, no, based on direct labor hours. So you simply multiply this and you will get your estimated overhead for this job at 32. Now, assuming there are no other costs incurred, Now, you can now summarize your cost and you will get this 3. O, di ba? So, i-compute natin 116 plus 88 plus 32, you will get 236 as your total cost for this job. How come your unit product cost is 118? That's because for this job, there are 2 units. So, you simply divide $236 by 2 units. Each unit will have an average cost of 118. Okay, so that's for your job cost sheet. Interpreting the average unit cost. The average unit cost should not be interpreted as the cost that would actually be incurred if an additional unit were produced. Bakit kaya? It's because of the fixed cost. Sabi niya, fixed cost would not change if another unit were produced. So, the incremental cost of another unit may be somewhat less than 118. Now, as a review, we all know that your fixed overhead, no? Your fixed overhead is, how do you draw that? Ganito na lang, para mas madali. It is fixed in total. That's your total fixed cost. No? Pero per unit, it is decreasing at a decreasing rate. So, the more unit you produce, the lower will be your fixed cost per unit. Parang kuan lang yan. Parang Unlitex. O, di ba? Unlitex. Ayan, yung 10 pesos ba? Pinakamura na Unlitex. So, habang mas marami kang tinetext, okay, mas mababa yung cost to text natin. Okay, cost per text. Ayun. Now, let's continue. Let's have a quick check. Okay, so you have the following job which requires $200 of direct materials and 10 direct labor hours at 15 per hour. Your estimated total overhead for the year was 716. And estimated direct labor hours were 20. Ayan, what would be required as the cost of the job? So first, we have to start with direct materials. So yeah, so feel free, i-pause nyo muna, no, para walang spoiler. At tapos i-solve mo siya. Ayan. Kunyari, na-solve mo na, tingnan natin. What is the cost of the job? So you start with the direct materials. Okay, here is already given at 200. And then what about the cost of your direct labor? No, you have 10 at 15, so you multiply that. And then you have 760, but this is not for the job. No, this is your total overhead for the year. So how much will be allocated to the job? So you have 760 divided by your direct labor hours na 20, you get the predetermined overhead rate. Since it's based on direct labor hours, that rate will be multiplied to 10 hours. Okay, so let's see. Your answer will be 730. Okay po. So, sana nakuha natin ito. So, let's have a short moment for you to internalize that habang magkakape ako. Okay, let's continue. Let's talk about the cost flow, and the document flow for job order costing. Ayan, so just to summarize, para mabilis lang, okay, the story starts with the sales order, no? For example, a customer goes to your a customer goes to your office, tapos mag-order siya, I want this and that, these are the specifications. So you're going to write that down, okay? Ayan, isa-summarize lahat yan sa sales order. Now, from the sales order, that will now be the basis for the production order. So you're now going to assign that to the worker or to the department who is in charge for the production of the product. And then from there, okay, you come up with a materials requisition slip. So based on the production order, okay, or sales order, ganun, di ba? Oh, so this will be the materials that are required. Ayan. And in your materials requisition, it will include your direct materials and indirect materials. For direct materials, okay, that will go directly to your job cost sheet, while your indirect materials will go to your manufacturing overhead account. This is where you accumulate, okay, the cost of manufacturing overhead. And then at the end of the period, you're going to assign the estimate. Okay, mamaya medyo madugo to eh. Pero as of this point, I just want to inform you that we accumulate the actual cost but we assign the estimated cost for manufacturing overhead. Okay? I'll show you the summary later. And then you also have your employee time ticket. Okay, and then from your employee time ticket, you can determine how much of that will be your direct labor cost and how much will be the indirect labor. So for direct labor cost, they will go directly to your job cost sheet, while your indirect labor will then go to your manufacturing overhead account. No? I-accumulate muna natin siya doon. Now, in your manufacturing overhead account, okay, where your indirect labor, diba? Yun, kanina papunta doon. Tapos ito, and other actual overhead charges, no? Pupunta dito, i-accumulate natin. Actual yan actual, okay? And then from there, we apply your estimated overhead to your job cost sheet. So, dito na nag-umpisa yung question, sir, what if the total of the actual charges is different from the applied? Okay, so doon na papasok yung over or under applied, which we will discuss later. Let's examine the cost flow in a job order costing system. Eto, alam na ninyo to. Okay, sounds familiar. You have your raw materials, okay, manufacturing overhead, and work in process, okay, which is actually represented by your job cost sheet. Ito yung sinabi ko kanina, your manufacturing overhead. You have here your actual, you have here your applied. Okay, it will help if you go back to our discussion, no, in the costing systems, no, wherein at the end you have your cheat sheet, diba? You will have a summary of the entries for accumulation and assigning. Okay, so first you have your materials purchases will be debited, no? It will be debited to your raw materials, and then your materials, once they are used, okay, if these are your direct materials, will go directly to your job cost sheet. So from there you already know the entry, no? Debit to work in process and credit to raw materials. Ayan. Pero if they are indirect materials, okay, you will debit manufacturing overhead and credit to raw materials. So that's for your materials. Oh, yan. Screenshot. Ayan. This will now be your entry to record the purchase. Debit materials. Balikan mo yung key accounts mo. Diba? You debit your materials purchases. Tama? And then you credit your accounts payable, or it could be vouchers payable, or it could be cash if it's already paid in cash. So that's the entry. Then also from your T accounts, you can actually reconstruct this entry, no? Debit to work in process, this one is for your direct materials. This one is for your indirect materials, coming from your raw materials. Yan. Okay, for your payroll, you have your salaries and wages payable. Ayan. So, halo-halo din kasi yan eh. You have the direct and indirect labor. For direct labor, that will go to your work in process. And for indirect labor, again, it will go to your manufacturing overhead. No? So, from there, na-visualize nyo na dapat yung mga entries natin. Debit work in process, debit manufacturing overhead, and credit salaries and wages payable. But when you incur this, diba, ano yung ide-debit mo dito? Debit to salaries and wages, and then credit to salaries and wages payable. Pwede yun. And then from salaries and wages, yung expense na yan, you can allocate that, okay, to work in process and manufacturing overhead. Ayun, pwede kung gusto mo ng mas mahaba. But if you can do this approach, di mas maganda, diretso ka na sa work in process and manufacturing overhead. So this is now your journal entry to record your labor cost, whether it's direct labor or indirect direct labor. Okay, so let's continue. Kunyari, malapit na matapos, okay? You have the other cost, no? Other overhead. So, debit to manufacturing overhead and credit cash or credit vouchers payable. Ayan. Or if these are already recorded from other expenses, you just have to reduce those expenses, okay, by crediting them. Ayan. So, for example, ganyan. Diba? So, debit manufacturing overhead and credit accounts payable, property taxes payable, prepaid insurance, and accumulated depreciation. For example, before doing this entry, there was already an entry which is debit to, kunyari, let's talk about this. Debit to depreciation expense and credit accumulated depreciation. Okay, so let's assume that that's the journal entry. Okay. And then you found out that a part of your depreciation expense should go to your manufacturing overhead. So, instead of crediting accumulated depreciation, you credit depreciation expense na lang dito. Ayan, to reduce your depreciation expense. Anyway, you don't need to credit accumulated depreciation na because initially it's already credited. Okay. Ano pa? So, you have here now your direct materials and direct labor. Okay. And then you have here your manufacturing overhead. What happens next? Ito na po yung assignment or application of overhead. Take note, these are actual costs. This one is just the applied or estimated or standard. Ayan. Ang daming mga terms dyan. And it's normal, no, that it's not equal to your actual because take note, this one is only based on your estimated cost. Kasi may predetermined rate tayo na ginagamit. So, if actual and applied manufacturing overhead are not equal, a year-end adjustment is required. So, ano to? This is your overhead applied. Applied. Ayan. So, ito yung standard or estimated. That's the journal entry. Non-manufacturing costs are not assigned to individual jobs, rather they are expense at the period incurred. Why? Because they are non-manufacturing cost eh. Diba? Like salaries expense of employees in marketing and selling or advertising expenses. And these are the entries to record them. They will not go to our work in process. Okay? They are not found in our job cost sheet. Okay, so you now have your direct materials, direct labor, and overhead. Okay, once it's already finished, okay, you can now assign that to your finished goods. So this is now the cost of goods manufactured. Ayan. Now, assuming there are different products, okay, you can summarize them, no, into one controlling work in process. What do I mean? So, for example, you have the job cost sheet for product 1 or job number 1, job number 2, job number 3. All of these, let's go back. Ayan. All of these will have their own T accounts, no, for their work in process. So, may kanya-kanyang T accounts yan. And for each T account, will have their own direct materials, direct labor, and overhead. So, yung mga direct materials dito, okay, direct materials for job 1, direct materials for job 2, direct materials for job 3 will now be summarized here. Ganun din sa direct labor and overhead. Pag natapos, yun na yung pupunta naman sa cost of goods manufactured natin. So, it's possible that for the current period, only job number 1 and job number 2, okay, is finalized. So, sila lang yung natapos. So, they will form part of your cost of goods manufactured. So, the ending balance now, will come from your job number 3. So, those are just some of the common questions, no? That at the end of the period, how much is the total materials incurred by the company? Okay, that's the direct materials from J1, J2, and J3. Oh, ganun. How much is the cost of goods manufactured? Okay, so, from J1 and J2 only, the cost for J1 and J2. Or they could ask you, how much is the direct materials associated with the cost of goods manufactured? Then it's only asking for the direct materials of J1 and J2. Okay? Or how much is the direct materials associated with the ending balance of your work in process? So that will now be the direct materials coming from J3, yung hindi pa natin natapos. Okay po? So if job 1 and job 2 is already finished, they will now be assigned to your finished goods, and the journal entry is a debit to your finished goods and credit to work in process, yung controlling account natin. And then from there, if it's already sold, it becomes part of our cost of goods sold. Okay, so it will now move away from our balance sheet, no, from our inventories account, and it will now be part of our income statement, no, as part of our cost of goods sold. Okay po. Ta-da. And this is now the entry. Okay, sir, bakit dalawa? This one is the entry to record the sale. Okay, and this one is the entry to record the cost of your sales. No, di ba? Perpetual kasi tayo. Okay, so gumagamit tayo ng costing system. Ayan. Okay po. So, now let's go back. No, kanina may problema tayo. Sir, yung actual is different from our standard or from our applied. Okay, now the difference will be considered as an overapplied or underapplied. We have an underapplied overhead if the applied, no, during the period, no, the applied cost is lower than your actual cost. No? Overapplied if it's higher or greater than our actual cost. So, you try to imagine, no? You try to imagine your T accounts. Assuming this is our T accounts for manufacturing overhead. You have here your actual, okay, and then you have here your applied. Okay, so if the total of your actual is greater than the applied, that's underapplied. If it's the opposite, mas malaki yung applied, it's overapplied. So, merong difference. So, the difference will now be closed. So, how do we close the difference? Ayan. So, we'll have an example. Because actual overhead for the year was 650 and the total of 170 direct labor hours worked on jobs. Now, take note, this is actual. How much total overhead was applied to Pirco's jobs during the year? Use the predetermined overhead rate of 4. So, you multiply 4 by 170 and then compare that to 650. So, you have your overhead applied, that's 4 times 170, you have 680. Okay, so 680. Compare that with 650, we now have a 30,000 that is overapplied. So, mas malaki yung credit side ng manufacturing overhead T accounts natin. Kung mas malaki yung credit side, para i-close yun, you have to debit that. Tama po? Tuloy natin yan mamaya. But first, let's have a quick check. Okay, so you pause the video, try to answer this. Okay, kunyari, sinagutan mo na siya. Okay, what will be your answer? It's asking for Tiger's manufacturing overhead. It's 50,000 underapplied. Okay, so your overhead applied is 1,160. And then you have an actual of 1,210. Kulang po tayo ng 50,000. So, kung kulang ng 50,000 yung applied, this means that your actual is greater. Mas malaki naman yung nakadebit. So, to close that, kailangan siyang i-credit. Okay? Kunyari, nasundan nyo yun. Feel free to rewind the video, no? Para mabalik-balikan nyo at masundan. Anyway, let's continue. Going back to this 30,000 earlier. Okay? It's over-applied. So, because it's over-applied, okay, the credit side is greater. Okay? Now, to close that, okay, there are actually two ways. No, you can allocate this to your work in process, finished goods, and cost of goods sold, or you can just go directly to your cost of goods sold, which is actually easier. So, to close this to your cost of goods sold, paano nga kung over-applied, mas malaki yung credit. So, you debit your manufacturing overhead and credit to your cost of goods sold. So, you reduce your cost of goods sold. Okay. Sir, paano kapag work in process? I-reduce mo yung tatlong yan. Work in process, finished goods, and cost of goods sold. But how do we allocate them? Okay, so tingnan muna natin to. 650 versus 680. And then, this one is greater by 30. So, to close that, okay, you should go to your cost of goods sold. Debit, manufacturing overhead, and credit, cost of goods sold. So, bababa yung cost of goods sold natin. Pag bumaba yung cost of goods sold, tataas naman yung profit natin. Bakit ganun? Okay? Take note that your actual cost is only 650. By applying 680, you're actually overstating the cost of production. So if production cost, especially overhead cost, no? If manufacturing overhead, dito tayo. So if overhead was overapplied, overhead was overstated. Okay, so if it's overstated, it will follow that your cost of goods manufactured will be overstated, cost of goods sold will be overstated, then gross profit or your net income will be understated. So kulang. Kaya bawasan natin, no? By reducing your cost of goods sold, okay, you are actually correcting the effects, no, in your gross profit or in your net income. Okay. So what if it's being allocated to work in process finished goods and cost of goods sold? Or ang question muna ay, Sir, bakit pupunta muna sa work in process finished goods and cost of goods sold? Kasi if you have your T accounts, no, starting from your work in process, you have here your overhead. Okay? Saan pupunta yan? Pag hindi natapos, it will go to the ending balance of your work in process. And then, it will go to your cost of goods manufactured. And your cost of goods manufactured will go to your finished goods. Tama po. It will go to your finished goods. Okay. Burahin natin ito saglit. Ayan. Cost of goods manufactured. And your cost of goods manufactured, if it's not sold, it will be part of your ending balance and it will be part of your cost of goods sold kapag nabenta na. Kaya saan pupunta yung misstatement sa overhead natin? Oops, pupunta siya dito. Pupunta doon and pupunta dito. This is where you will find the misstatement. Not necessarily misstatement. We'll just use over-application, no, of your overhead. This is where you will find them. So all you have to do is to use these values, your work in process, finished goods, and cost of goods sold, come up with a ratio and use that to allocate. So if these are the amount of your work in process, finished goods, and cost of goods sold, you have 68 divided by 680, that is 10%. Okay, so lagay mo dyan. Divided by 680. Divide this by 680. Divide this by 680. And you get the following. This is now the percentage that you will use to allocate what? 30,000. So you multiply, no? 10% times 30,000. 30% times 30,000 times 30,000. And you get the following. Total of 30,000. So, this will now be your journal entry. Earlier, it's just a credit to your cost of goods sold, which is 30. But using this approach, okay, you will now have a credit to work in process, finished goods inventory, and cost of goods sold. Tama? So, balikan natin. Look at this. So, if this one is over-applied, we expect that this one is also overstated. Overstated and overstated. So, to correct that, no, you debit, no, you credit work in process, finished goods, and cost of goods sold. Okay po, para mabawasan. Diba? Basic concept on adjusting journal entries from your Basic accounting, lahat ng kulang, dagdagan, lahat ng sobra, bawasan. Okay. So, sir, what about the entries? If it is underapplied, it's just the opposite. Okay. Lahat ng dinebit, i-credit. Lahat ng naka-credit, i-debit. Okay, so, let's continue. Ayan, so for the alternative one, okay, it's the easiest. Okay, you simply close it to your cost of goods sold if it's underapplied, no? So, you increase that. If it's overapplied, you decrease your cost of goods sold. Ito yung example natin kanina. Ayan. It's underapplied, you increase your work in process, finished goods, and cost of goods sold. Okay? Sir, bakit ito cost of goods sold lang? O di kulang na, may problema na yung work in process and finished goods natin. Yes, that is true. But it will just create a timing difference. Eventually, your work in process will be finished, so it will go to your finished goods, no? And eventually, your finished goods will be sold, so eventually matatapos yan doon sa cost of goods sold. So, may i-adjust din siya in the end. Okay, quick check. What effect will the overapplied overhead have on peer cost net operating income? Okay, so kung overapplied yung overhead, ano raw yung effect niya? So, sobra yung cost, kulang dapat. Diba? Pero, tingnan nyo yung sagot niya. It will increase. Mali kasi yung question dito. Dapat, what is now the effect of the journal entry to record or to close the overapplied overhead? Because your net income is understated, okay, the entry will increase the net operating income. So, ganun dapat. Medyo kulang lang yung pagkaka-question dyan. Anyway, let's talk about multiple predetermined overhead rates. Okay, so to this point, we have assumed that there is a single predetermined overhead rate called the plant-wide overhead rate. Okay, yun yung sinabi na ng GAP okay? Pero there are reasons why you can have multiple predetermined overhead rate, no? Like for example, for large companies, okay, they use a lot, no? They use a lot of overhead rates, predetermined overhead rates kasi nga, okay, you cannot just apply a cost using one activity base. Some of your costs may be causally related to direct labor hours. Some of your costs may be related to machine hours. Okay, so, and so on and so forth. Some, no, may be related to your direct materials used. For example, let's talk about paint, no, and sandpaper. Di ba habang mas marami kang materials na ginagamit, mas marami din tayong sandpaper na nagagamit. Okay, so that's why it's better to apply this based on the quantity of materials used, yan, or quantity of direct materials. Ayan. Kung masyado ako mabilis magsalita, i-slow down nyo na lang yung speed sa YouTube. Di ba? Daming advantages, no? Kapag nasa YouTube yung video. Maybe more complex, but maybe more accurate because it reflects differences across departments. Job order costing in service companies. Pwede ba yun? Job order costing is used in many different types of service companies. Like for example, no, mga law firms. Okay, kasi pag minsan the level of difficulty, no, of these cases, okay, differ. So dapat yung cost will also differ. Ayan. Mga nasa accounting, nasa medical field, so yung mga ganyan. Okay. And then the use of information technology, ngayon mas mabilis na, especially if your inputs are all barcoded. Okay, naka-POS na siya. Yan, technology plays an important part in many job order cost systems. Now, when combined with electronic data interchange or your EDI or something that is web-based, no, XML, okay, barcoding eliminates the inefficiencies and inaccuracies associated with manual clerical process. O, di ba? Scan na lang tapos nasa job cost sheet na siya. Kapag natapos na yung product mo, okay, ano mangyayari? Automatic, may job cost sheet ka na And kahit hindi pa nga tapos, no, nakikita na yung estimated cost ng product. Yun naman ang maganda dito. Okay, so before you finalize the product, you can already see that, uy, you're spending more than the estimated cost for this product. Kailangan yata i-adjust mo yung selling price. Okay, so yung mga ganung bagay. Anyway, so that's it. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask. Okay, especially in our chat section doon sa Canvas. Okay, so maybe the next video will be, ano ba? May next video tayo dito eh. It's focused on the computation of predetermined overhead rate and the effect on capacity. So that will now be your reading assignment. Okay, so that's it.